Hi, this video is to show how to use the expenses spreadsheet. First, the location. It's inside the client folder, and there's a subfolder called Evidence. Inside Evidence, there's the expenses subfolder. And here you see the expenses spreadsheet. So let's open it up and have a look. Here you see the main spreadsheet, or the main page on the spreadsheet that you'll use. There are actually several pages, as you can see. Here's one for notes. Here's the main one where you enter the expenses. The bottom line is one that adds up the expenses in a table. And the rest of them are kind of utilitarian that you only use every once in a while. But to quickly look at them, this one is the table that holds the IRS data. And it shows that it's from the most recent release of the IRS figures for November of 2015. The table here looks somewhat similar to the master table, and basically this master table links to the raw data for the various counties, the various family sizes, and the various categories on the master table. There's a second IRS table that shows the breakdown of some of the IRS standards according to the number of people in the family. And again, it's for the November 2015 release of figures. So let's go back to our main page here. And this is the one that you'll use most of the time. The expenses spreadsheet is one of two schedules that have their own spreadsheet. The other is income. Because of the calculations involved in those two categories and because of the level of detail that we dive into on them, they each have their own spreadsheet to make that easier. So we can look at this spreadsheet in a little more detail. And the first you see about it is that it has several categories. If we scroll down, we'll see the categories that are involved on Schedule J. And this spreadsheet is largely put in the same order as Schedule J. There might be some small variations, but more or less it follows the Schedule J. And it goes all the way through to the list of categories that we use. You may notice that there are some of the cells in a light yellow, as is the case in many of the spreadsheets this office uses. When you see a yellow cell, it tends to be one that is a calculated cell or one that refers to another cell. So that if you look up here in the formula bar, you see that there's a formula in the yellow cell. And you can see by highlighting it that it adds up all the figures that are listed in the column above it. To demonstrate how that works then, if the debtor has a mortgage or a rent payment of, let's say, $1,700, we type it into the red column and it fills in several other cells. The first it fills in, as you can see, is the yellow cell at the bottom. Let's suppose that the debtor had some homeowner's insurance, or let's call it mortgage insurance, of $90. It adds that to the $1,700 and tallies it up here. You can see that as soon as the figures are entered, it also fills them in this column and in this column. And it also fills them in up here. And to demonstrate that again, I'll type my figures in again. 1,700. And you'll see that these columns also have some of their cells filled in. I'll add my mortgage insurance back. And there we are for the moment. In addition to this being the main spreadsheet, there are a couple of columns that you use more than the others. And the first is the debtors column, which is in red. And the second is the green column for making adjustments. And the purpose of the spreadsheet is to allow us to see what the debtor tells us their expenses are, and then make adjustments as necessary. Oftentimes debtors forget about categories. Oftentimes they only have a poor idea of what they spend on certain items. And given their income, it's clear that they must be making different expenses than they think. So we try to come up with the reasonable budget by using the adjustments column. Now, in the example that we're working on here, we filled in a few of the expenses, and we could go down and add some others. Suppose electricity was estimated at being $175 a month. Now, that's kind of high, and if we wanted to make a note for our records about why the electricity was high, we have a space here where we can type in a little explanatory note. And that gives us some idea later when we're coming back to know why some of the unusual expenses might be what they are. There's another place to make notes. This is the Schedule J tab. And generally, I think it's preferable to make notes right where we see the figures, but there will be times when we want to make some explanatory notes of a more general nature, possibly explaining changes that we expect in expenses and so forth. So under the principle of keeping the information in one place whenever possible, specific notes on specific items may tend to show up here, sometimes notes about why we've made an adjustment, for example, whereas more general notes about the debtor's expenses may show up on this notes spreadsheet. And generally this one doesn't get too much information put on it. It's usually empty. Going back then to the master spreadsheet, we've entered in a few more items, and we can see that it's tallying them up little by little. In some of these categories, there are sub-tallies within the category. One example, of course, is utilities, where the Schedule J form has 3 categories. So we also divide it up into those 3 categories. But then it's important to notice that these dotted line tallies are added up separately, and then they're combined down here. Maybe we should demonstrate that if we had $50 for water and $25 for sewer. We can see that this cell adds those figures up. This dotted line cell adds up the electricity. And then down below, both of those cells are added up for the final figure. Now, a few more things to consider. We have not talked about the income. Normally, the income will be input from the income spreadsheet. For now, I'm just going to manually type it in. And I've typed in 4,750. And now you can see that this table takes the additional step of comparing the expenses to the income. With an income of 4,750, up to this point, we've entered $2,040 of expenses, and here we get the bottom line. It tells us that there's $2,710 left. As we go on and fill in other categories, this figure should go down. Just to demonstrate up here, suppose that there were homeowners association fees of $150 a month. We enter that, and we can see that now this figure has gone up, and then the leftover has gone down. One column that we haven't paid much attention to so far is column D, the IRS column. And what this column does is input the data from the IRS standards. And then the data is also, once it's included in this column, it's input into the other columns as well, except for the debtor and the adjustments, because we make those ones independently. But then we can compare them to what the IRS figures are. So we want to set it to the right county and the right family size, which we can do over here. Let's say we were actually in Snohomish County. And you can see that these figures are going to change because they vary by location as well as family size. So we should expect to see these other cells jump as they change. So we type in Snohomish. Let's go down to this one, and we see that the figures change. Let's change the family size to 3, and then they should go down a little bit. And now we see what the figures are for Snohomish with a family of 3. The final step then will be to make adjustments, which we can make now in the adjustments column. And an example of this may be if our debtor has given a pretty low estimate of their food. Sometimes that happens and they think that they spend $200 a month on food. But we can see that that's a lot less than the IRS standards, which gives us a little leeway for allowing them more spending on their food, especially if the reality is they must be spending more than that and they don't have any money at the end of the month. That means they're spending money somewhere, and a very likely candidate is that they simply misestimated how much they spend on food. So we can come here, and the $200 was automatically input, but now we manually change it. And you can see, if you look up top, this cell says that it refers to the food groceries debtor cell. Well, that one obviously is the one that we just filled in. At this point, though, we're going to vary it, and let's say we assume from our review of the expenses that they must be spending more like $450 on food, and therefore we type in $450. $450 then adjusts the Schedule J column, while the means test stays with the IRS column. And we can see that the bottom line has also changed between the two debtor and adjustment columns. We now show that there's less leftover income because we've added an extra $250 in expenses. And that basically is how the table is set up to work, to allow us to quickly make adjustments, see if they make sense, see if they work, and then input them into Schedule J. So jumping back to the top of the table, you can see how our table is developing. I won't go through the rest of it, but as we entered in more of the expenses, we would expect that this bottom line figure would get more in balance with the income. And if it didn't, and we had made all the adjustments that we could reasonably justify, then we would at least know that we had a problem that we had to address in some way, possibly by trying to find something that the debtors could cut back on, or sometimes in some cases spend more on, in order to have income and expenses balance when we're standing in front of the trustee. And that is most of what you need to know to use this expenses spreadsheet. A few things that generally apply to spreadsheets are worth keeping in mind. This spreadsheet uses a freeze pane, which means that the top rows are frozen in place, so that when we scroll down, you can see that they seem to slide behind the top 5 rows. The top 5 rows stay in place so that we can keep an eye on our bottom line. Another feature that the spreadsheet has that oftentimes pops up in our spreadsheets is that there are some hidden columns. For example, you can see that this column is L, this column is, you can barely see M, and then it jumps to Y, meaning a lot of the letters between M and Y are missing. That's one of your signs that there are some hidden columns. A second sign is when you see this double line, that's also an indication that there's some hidden columns. In this case, the hidden columns are there in order to allow for other scenarios. In order to reveal them, you right-click after, well, let me back up. You select the columns, you right-click to choose Unhide, And then you see that there's some other columns set up just like the others. And these are for complicated cases where we're trying to consider multiple scenarios. And possibly there's one set of choices that the debtor could make that might give him a better outcome, but we're not sure, and a different set of scenarios involves a different set of trade-offs, and we just want to see them side by side. So that's what the hidden columns are there for. Not used too often, but they're there when needed. Control Z will undo the last action and hide the columns again. Another aspect of the spreadsheet, earlier I simply filled in the income, and we started working with some figures that I'd put in manually. But when we use this spreadsheet, we're going to use it in combination with the income spreadsheet. And the way we do that is by connecting the two. The bottom line spreadsheet page is where we do that. And you can see up here that we have the same basic column format. And what these rows do is add up the figures. The most important part, however, is this cell here that is in red, or outlined in red. And that one is normally connected to the income spreadsheet. We'll show that in a separate video, but to show how it works, once you connected it to the income spreadsheet, it would fill in these other ones automatically. If I manually change this here to, let's say, 3,750, you will see that the other columns all change, or the other cells all change. So when we make changes to the income spreadsheet, sometimes this one will change automatically, and we'll have a different outcome on our expenses spreadsheet. Lastly, this particular table not only has a vertical freeze pane, but it has a horizontal one, so that the categories are visible if you have to scroll to the left or right. That's something to keep in mind if the table doesn't seem to be functioning right, or if it seems to be, if you open it and it seems weird compared to the last time you looked at it, it may well just be because the page was left in a different position and you can't see some of it as usual. That's the way the expenses spreadsheet works.